Tommy's Matchbook. It's always been a primary weapon that could crank out some pretty respectable damage, but it comes at a price. A price that I honestly was never really comfortable paying. It just got two substantial buffs in short order though. In Season 20, it got boosted up with the blanket 25% auto rifle damage increase, and here in Season of the Deep, it can now directly apply Scorch to enemies. This not only ups its potential damage yet again, but makes it even more formidable in terms of ad clearing, and unlocks a lot of synergy opportunities if you're pairing it with a solar subclass. This video is just going to be my standard breakdown though. Stats, perks, damage, functionality, performance. But I'll see if I can cook you up a build video down the line here to show you how I like to spec out when I'm using Tommy's. But let's dive in with a quick look at this weapon's stats and perks. Tommy's Matchbook is an exotic solar auto rifle firing at 720 rounds per minute with 100 rounds in the magazine. Even though for some reason it is only displaying 72, but it is 100. The weapon stat line is fairly average for the most part given the 720 RPM fire rate. The airborne effectiveness and aim assist are pretty solid though, sitting at 36 and 81 respectively. But as I'm sure you've taken note of, the 0 in the reload stat is, yeah. Tommy's intrinsic trait is ignition trigger. Sustained fire with this weapon overheats it, increasing the damage but burning the user. The exotic perk is heat sink, stating that the overheated self-damage is reduced when not aiming down sights. And I don't know why they added the Scorch text to the perk because it is directly tied to having the catalyst unlocked, but when in this overheated state, it'll now be applying Scorch stacks to enemy targets. Also, once you unlock the catalyst, when ignition trigger is active, your health will recover much faster. And keep in mind, this is only referring to the red portion of your health bar once you've gone critical. This is not going to speed up the regen rate of your white shield bar. And if you've yet to acquire this weapon and it does sound like something that you'd like to get your hands on, it is available for direct purchase at the exotic weapon kiosk located near the tower vaults, provided you have access to the Shadowkeep content. But with that, we do have some functionality points that we need to touch on. With Tommy's, when you're holding down the trigger, after the 20th round is fired, ignition trigger will proc, putting the weapon in its overheated state. When this happens, you will get a substantial damage boost, you will start applying Scorch stacks to targets, and you will start taking self-damage. And while it can completely strip your shield, it will not eat into the red portion of your health bar. You are able to help negate the rate at which you take self-damage though. When aiming down sights, as soon as ignition trigger kicked in, my shield was completely gone in 3.54 seconds. When firing from the hip, it took 5.05 seconds to completely deplete my shield, roughly a 40% improvement. This test was performed at tier 9 resilience though, and resilience does factor in. I tried this again at tier 2 resilience and saw my shield was completely gone in 3.19 seconds when aiming down sights, and it lasted for about 4.65 seconds when firing from the hip. So not a huge discrepancy, but resilience definitely does play a part. Also, if you do have an overshield, the burn is going to have to work through that first before digging into your standard white shield bar. And any sustained healing that you're able to deploy, like restoration, will obviously combat the effect of the burn. Another thing to make note of is Tommy's does have near perfect hipfire accuracy. When firing the weapon, you can see that the aim assist crosshairs do pinch in slightly, but with a standard 720 auto rifle, you can see that accuracy circle bloom out as the weapon is fired. With Tommy's, it's completely static, not wavering one bit. And last thing to note here, I do have the reload speed clocked in at a pretty lengthy 3.25 seconds. With that, let's move into the damage testing, but my general disclaimer first.
PVE damage numbers are variable and will change depending on content scaling or enemy tier. I'm performing my testing in the Spire the Watcher dungeon at the Aklos encounter, in hopes to collect more relevant data versus a wider spectrum of enemies, while still keeping the information comparable from video to video.
So I did have every intention on rehashing my Tommy's Matchbook breakdown last season. That is, until Bungie announced that Tommy's was going to be a Scorch applying weapon in Season 21. I guess the good part about that is we can reference last season's numbers, which I'll have on the left side of the screen, and for this season all we have to do is roll in the extra damage from the Scorch application. Starting out versus Aklos, the first 20 shots crit for 987 and jump to 1958 once the weapon overheats. We also begin to see those Scorch ticks pile up, and they continue to grow up until there's about 35 rounds left in the magazine, where we secure the ignition, dealing 12,269 points of damage. The Scorch ticks reset, but they do build back up as we maintain damage, but it's not quite enough to proc a second ignition before the weapon runs out of ammo. All in all, the Scorch application, with the ticks and the ignition, tack on an additional 23,192 to last season's 176,380 points of damage. Totaling those out, that's 199,572 points of damage dealt in a single magazine. It does take 8.24 seconds to fire off all 100 rounds, which puts the single mag damage per second at 24,220. That equates to roughly 13% more damage output than we were seeing last season, with the single mag DPS climbing by about 3,000 points. Where Tommy's is really going to put in the work though, is versus major and minor tier enemies. You know, targets that you would more typically use a primary weapon against. Just in last season's bullet damage alone, it was clipping over 30k versus majors and 40k versus red bars in terms of DPS. And keep in mind that is accounting for the 20 rounds at base damage as well. Those numbers will certainly be a bit higher if you're already overheated when you shift your focus onto a target. When considering the Scorch damage versus these tiers though, it's going to be highly variable as to how much you're actually going to see. Content scaling and the overall health of your target are going to be a big factor. So I didn't roll any of the Scorch ticks into the updated damage values, but I did credit each tier for 1 ignition. So that's another 17,337 versus majors and 24,272 versus minors. Whether you can actually achieve an ignition in-game is going to be determined on a case-by-case basis, but they're rolled into the final figures just for continuity's sake. One more thing I wanted to look at here though, Tommy's Scorch with Ember of Ashes. With the additional stacks applied thanks to the fragment, a double ignition is possible within a single magazine. Here, with about 50 rounds remaining in the magazine, we see the initial ignition touch off. And then again, with 15 rounds left, we get the second. The Scorch damage itself does diminish a touch since we're spending less time building stacks during the damage cycle, but this is buying us about 8,000 more points in terms of single mag damage, and the corresponding damage per second does go up by almost 1,000 to 25,185. So, if you're one of those Actium Warwig wearing Titans, you can probably get a lot of ignitions in a single magazine. I didn't test it personally, but if you'd like to go try it out, I'd be very interested in hearing how many you're able to secure. On to the performance section though. Tommy's fills the role of a general ad clearing weapon extremely well in almost all of the game's content. Strong damage, high volume of bullets, plus some extra damage over time from the Scorch burn. It's just very effective versus everything from your standard trash ads to healthier major tier targets. And the ignitions. And while some of our other Scorch applying weapons can secure an ignition outright, Tommy's just does it extremely efficiently. I mean, it only takes about 4 seconds of sustained fire to touch one off. Less than that if you're using Ember of Ashes. And because those ignitions are so easy to come by, Tommy's can be a reliable weapon for stunning unstoppable champions. With the small caveat, but more on that in a second. And if you are using this weapon outside of its optimal range, obviously your bullet damage is going to diminish. But the Scorch and the ignitions do not care about the range. So as long as you can put those bullets on the enemies, Tommy's can do some work even if you're stretching it out a little bit. And since Tommy's is now a Scorch applying weapon, this opens things up to the point where nearly every fragment on our solar subclasses can either boost this weapon directly, or reap some sort of passive benefit from the added Scorch utility. I'm gonna elaborate a bit more in my upcoming build video, but there is plenty of great synergy to be had here. For the weapon's drawbacks, here in Season 21, things can be a little janky when it comes to stunning champions. I'm sure most people are taking anti-barrier auto rifle in the seasonal artifact because it's the only anti-barrier option in there. But since Bungie doesn't like the same weapon double dipping on anti-champion utility, this does override the ignition's ability to stun unstoppables. There is a workaround that you can use that I highlighted in this video here. I'll have it up on the end screen if you do want to check it out. But the fact remains, it does need a workaround if you have anti-barrier auto selected. Unfortunate, but it is what it is. Then the reload speed. Extremely slow. It almost feels necessary to boost it up a little bit with some loader mods, or even better, take advantage of some sort of class-specific means to bypass that reload altogether. But either way, you may be making some concessions to negate the pain point. Then the ignitions, while they're still a great feature of the weapon, are toned down a little bit from what we're used to seeing. And ultimately, I'd have to think Bungie did this just to keep the weapon in check. Like we saw earlier versus Akalos, Tommy's ignition damage was 12,269. But with an ability-based ignition, we're looking at 32,006. So that's quite the reduction on an ignition generated purely by Tommy's bullet damage. Now, the self-damage, the ultimate crux of Tommy's matchbook. This is an extremely powerful primary weapon, but you're gonna pay for it with your health meter. Now, in lower end content, it's not all that bad. Enemies aren't terribly lethal, and you can drop them fairly quick. As long as you don't get caught in a really bad spot with your pants down, I mean, you're probably gonna be fine. If you're taking Tommy's into high-end content though, the self-damage cannot go unchecked. If you're constantly down on the red portion of your health bar, you are very susceptible to getting one-shot. So I mean, high resilience, high recovery, some sort of damage mitigation, some way of healing yourself. Always fire from the hip when you can. Keep on the move, make yourself a hard target to hit. The more overall survivability that you can pack on, the better. And I mean, you can make it work. But then at what point are you dedicating so many resources and mental energy to survivability that you're lowering your overall effectiveness in that activity? In the end, I mean, that's gonna be your call. Tommy's is a weapon that can get the job done, but how much are you willing to sacrifice to make that a reality? For me personally, the answer is a lot, actually. I'm willing to make a lot of concessions to use Tommy's. Why? Because I'm having a blast with this weapon here in Season of the Deep. Which is kind of ironic because there was a point where I don't think you could have paid me to touch this gun. But because of the addition of Scorch, the blanket auto rifle buff that we got last season, and a few key mods that were added to the Solar subclass kit in Lightfall, Tommy's has quickly become one of my favorite general use exotics. When we get some Solar mod support back in the artifact, I'm gonna be ready. But that's gonna do it for me. Please remember to leave the video a like if you did enjoy it. Consider subscribing to the Ironworker Gaming channel if you're not already and you would like to catch more of my Destiny 2 content. You guys are awesome, and I'll catch you on the next one.